In the first panel, we need to do something slightly difficult. We need to predict the future. And as Niels Bohr always says, that prediction is very difficult, especially if you're trying to predict the future. But if anyone can do that, that will be Roger Kornberg. Professor Roger Kornberg from Stanford University and from the Hebrew University received the Nobel Prize in 2006 for telling us how our genetic information is transcribed. So if he was able to do that, surely he can tell us about how to predict the future. Can I invite Professor Kornberg to join us, please? What I'd like to do is to ask you a question that's been on our minds for a very long time. People tend to make this distinction about applied research and basic research, etc. What is the importance in your mind of basic research in terms of propelling economy, discovery, etc.? What are your thoughts?
So I could answer that in a few words and then explain in a few more. In a few words, one of my colleagues who is a Russian physicist responsible for the technology that underlies cell phones, lasers, and so forth, for which he won a Nobel Prize in about the year 2000, George Alferov, told me once, all research is applied. It's only a question of time. And I think it's very true. And I could give you just a couple of striking examples from the area which I know best, which is biomedicine. Probably few of you would even be aware that modern medicine is only 100 years old. That at the end of the 19th century, it was still the case almost all disease was attributed to an imbalance of humors, and the only treatments were bleeding and violent purgatives. What changed all of that and brought us to where we are today is discoveries which led to application. And I am sure that if I asked around this room, from the majority of you who are not scientists, what were major discoveries that gave rise to modern medicine, you would think of the same things. You would think of x-rays. You would think of antibiotics. You might think of non-invasive imaging. X-rays were discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen around the year 1900 because of an interest in the discharge from a cathode ray tube. And he happened to notice, when studying the discharge, a glow on a fluorescent screen in the back of his laboratory. He put his hand over the cathode ray tube to discover what was passing from the tube, and he saw the image of the skeleton of his hand, the bones of his hand. Within 2 years, X-rays were in use in medicine, and he actually won the first Nobel Prize in physics shortly after. Antibiotics are a very well-known story, except that everybody gets it wrong. So everybody thinks that antibiotics were discovered by chance by Alexander Fleming when he saw something peculiar, dead cells on a petri dish. But the truth is that antibiotics, and in particular penicillin, owe their discovery and application to Ernst Chain. Chain was a refugee from Nazi Germany. He was both a musical and a scientific genius with a photographic memory. He was interested in the construction of bacterial cell walls, something quite unrelated to any application. He could recall having read an obscure paper by Alexander Fleming that had long since been forgotten that reported the observation without explanation. He discovered the source of the effect reported by Fleming. He identified penicillin. Within a few years, it transformed human health. It was the single most important change in the whole history of mankind in respect to human health. It eradicated the major cause of death. One last example, if I may,
by all means,
which and it connects to the Hebrew University in many ways, non-invasive imaging. I doubt if anyone here would realize that an important modality of non-invasive medical imaging is traceable back to the discoveries of Albert Einstein. It was Einstein's theory of relativity, which then led to relativistic quantum mechanics, which led to the prediction of the existence of the positron, which then led to PET scans, a very important method of non-invasive imaging for human health. Now, you might ask, so is that the end of discovery? Have we finally achieved the ultimate in modern medicine? And the answer is, in the first place, that we've only just begun. And in the second place, the future lies, in my view, especially in life sciences at the Hebrew University. We've only just begun, because I could easily demonstrate to anyone who's interested that we know less than 1/100th of 1% of what there is to learn about human biology. So if all of modern medicine is based on less than 1/100th of 1%, think of what would be possible if we knew the remaining 99.99%. The importance of the Hebrew University cannot be overestimated. The lesson from the past, from what I told you, if you want to solve an important problem, such as infectious disease, or the detection and cure of cancer, don't try and solve the problem directly, but rather pursue a curiosity about nature and the solutions of seemingly intractable problems will follow. Now, Einstein is an icon of 20th century physics. The 20th century was is thought of as the age of physics. Because of what I mentioned a moment ago, many of us, I think most, believe the 21st century will be the age of biology, especially the age of human biology, the age of biotechnology, the age of discovery of what remains to be found about human biology and its application to medicine. That will be made possible by fundamental work, by the pursuit of knowledge, as I mentioned, which is especially represented by my colleagues at the Institute of Life Science at the Hebrew University, where I have spent about a third, perhaps close to 40% of my time for the last 30 years. I discovered a world-class group of colleagues there from whom I have learned a great deal, and it is the younger generation there who I believe will make a major contribution to the future.
Roger, what do we need to do in order to bring about this cycle of innovation and discovery?
So, I recall when Lyndon Johnson once said, and this dates me, of course, few in the audience probably would remember what I do of that time. He said, we have to make sure that life-saving discoveries are not locked up in the laboratory. But of course, that wasn't the problem. The problem isn't isn't locking them up in the laboratory. The problem is the lack of the discoveries in the first place. How do you make them happen? Well, of course, people in government like Johnson would like to make a plan for discovery, but you can't plan discoveries. I mean, that's the very nature of serendipity. It happens unexpectedly. So how do you create an engine for discovery? Well, the answer, if you stop and think about it, is, of course, obvious. If you want to stumble on something, you have to try many times. You play a numbers game. The answer is to support the largest number of bright young people. I emphasize young because discovery, sad for me to say, though I keep trying, is the product of young minds. And in the words of James Watson, I'm too old to be unusual. But my junior colleagues at the Life Science Institute of the Hebrew University are, I think, unavoidably destined to make such important discoveries. You play a numbers game. It's not only to support young people, it's to support as many as possible. And if you support enough of them, discoveries that none of us could anticipate will happen, and they'll emerge from the pursuit of basic information, from the curiosity on the part of these many young people in the wonders of nature. So you play a numbers game. You want to support as many bright young people as possible, and that is one of my passions with respect to life science at the university, to enlarge the number of opportunities for young people there. And I don't think there's anything more important to the university, to the state of Israel, to the Jewish people or the world than to do that. Now, the numbers game, of course, goes on. You want as many as possible bright young people, and then they need to play the same, approach it in the same way. They need to try as many different ways of going about it and think as many hours as possible about the problem. And I recall a comment of my own graduate advisor at Stanford University, who was a great chemist, but a theoretical chemist. I was doing experimental work, and of course, as a theoretician, it was difficult for him to be very helpful. But he was very smart, and he understood the important point. And he said to me, look, the most important thing for you to do is go into the laboratory and fail every day. And that really is the watchword. It's for as many young people as possible to be able to try as hard and as much and as often as possible. And that actually raises another issue that really needs to be considered. In order for the bright young people who are there and those who we will recruit to the Life Science Institute and to the Hebrew University and all of its campuses, to succeed, they need not only the opportunity, but the infrastructure. And it has become much more expensive. And just to put it in perspective, when my father, who was a medical scientist, was a postdoctoral fellow at Washington University in St. Louis in 1946, so not that long ago, the budget for the laboratory of Carl and Gertie Corey, who were very famous biochemists, won the Nobel Prize actually that year, was $50 a year. The wherewithal for research was minimal because there was practically no instrumentation. There were no chemical companies from which to purchase all of the reagents ready-made for the research. They had to make everything themselves. They blew their own glassware, everything by hand. Of course, we live in a different world in that respect today, which is wonderful. It makes so much possible because young people don't even have to know what Shai and I learned when we were growing up. They just order a kit from a company and they follow the instructions. But the cost of being competitive and then of leading the way and of making discovery has risen dramatically. As President Ben Sasson can tell you, because he's worked so hard and successfully to create those conditions for young people at the university, it's possible but a great challenge. And I personally hope that every single person here will assist Menachem and me and Shai in meeting that challenge.
Absolutely. Remember, $50 a year, that goes a long way. But it is important, I'd like to stress what Professor Kornberg is saying. You can't discover the next cure for cancer with half a microscope. You can't discover the next galaxy with half a telescope. And at the end of the day, when you go to your GP in seek of remedy, you don't necessarily ask them, so what's the cheapest medicine that you have? You always ask what was the most effective medicine, regardless of cost. And that's one thing that we need to keep in the back of our minds. Roger, I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to ask you a difficult question. What do you think are the most urgent global challenges, and how shall we set about meeting them?
So, without any doubt, the most urgent challenge is existential. And that, of course, is global warming and climate change. And in a way, not directly relevant to my comments here this morning, except to say that it's a problem whose solution will be found, at least in part, in the same spirit as what I have mentioned. My colleagues, I have colleagues who are, of course, fine physicists, theoretical chemists, who know this problem far better than I. And you know, what you read in the press now can be confusing or even misleading. Scientists cannot predict the future. Scientists can, however, estimate probabilities. And the best estimate on the part of the most capable people, and it is a conservative estimate, is about a 40% of catastrophic outcome of global warming. And by that I don't mean rise in seawater levels, increase of the Earth's temperature by a degree or two, but literally catastrophic consequences beyond our ability to imagine. So the most urgent challenge is to confront climate change. I think closer to home, the challenges that we face with respect to quality of life come back to disease in all of its forms, not limited to, as it were, infectious disease or even cancer, but also including scourges such that I think are in some way inherent in our psychological makeup and therefore encoded in our genome, such as intolerance, leading, of course, to the kind of brutality that terrifies us all worldwide. Believe it or not, these challenges can also be addressed by the acquisition of knowledge about human biology and eventual development of rational strategies to overcome them.
I think that's a wonderful idea. Some of the work that we're doing at the Hebrew University doesn't just benefit the residents of Jerusalem, but it has benefit worldwide. And since we know that science is the true international language, you know, the mosquitoes that carry leishmaniasis don't stop at the border patrol. And watersheds are used with all of our neighbors, etc. So some of the solutions that we're bringing, hopefully, will be able to bridge between us and our neighbors. And I think it's a wonderful idea.
I might point out that the initiative that you, Shai, and Professor Ben Sasson have led with regard to neuroscience, brain science, over the last few years, will ultimately contribute in respect not only to disease, but human behavior.
Wonderful. Fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do something slightly irregular. We have 1 or 2 minutes, and if there's any questions from the audience, I would be very happy to entertain it at this point. Anyone?
Right here.
Please, go ahead. Harley?
I have a question about what are you... Wait.
1 second.
I just have a question as to what are you currently working on that could be enlightening for us? What captures your imagination now?
So my current research is directed towards 2 related questions. One is the mechanism by which information from the environment impinges upon our genome. We discovered, so my colleagues and I at Stanford discovered many years ago, a molecular computer that receives all information from the environment and in some way processes that information. These are signals which come from outside and also from within living cells. Processes that information, delivers it to the machinery for reading the genome. One of our objectives is to understand how the computer works. How does it receive, process information, and deliver a signal for readout of the genome. The other major objective of my work is in a way related. It concerns the structure of the genome. So as everyone knows, a few years ago, the one-dimensional structure was solved. The string of letters which constitutes the genetic code. but the information that resides in that long sentence is expressed in a way that depends upon its three-dimensional structure, how that long string of letters is coiled in space. At the very beginning of my career, so in the early 1970s, I discovered the first principle of such coiling. And strange as it may seem, no progress has been made since that time. We still only know what is the first step. And especially we don't know what are those that modulate the expression of genetic information. So the other major objective of my research today is to solve the three-dimensional structure of the human genome.
Fantastic. Well, our time is up. I'd like to thank Professor Kornberg and slightly disagree with you. Roger, I think not only young people have the potential for fantastic discoveries, as you have just shown.
Hope springs eternal.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much.